The first time he saw her, she was nothing more than a faint silhouette huddled in the corner of a crumbling alley. The dim light from the neon signs above flickered down on her fragile form, casting long, distorted shadows on the cracked pavement. It was late, colder than usual, and the streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional hovercraft whirring overhead. He had no reason to stop after all. His errands were finished, and the weight of a long day pulled at his bones. But something about the small, quivering figure made him pause. At first, he thought she was just another abandoned stray, one of the many orphaned creatures left to fend for themselves on this desolate colony world. He'd seen it countless times before, the broken systems leaving the youngest and weakest to scrape by in the margins. Yet as he stepped closer, the faint glow around her caught his attention, a shimmer that wasn't quite of this world. His breath caught as he realized what he was looking at. She wasn't human. Her skin, pale and translucent, seemed to catch the faintest traces of light, refracting it into soft, almost celestial hues. Her eyes, wide and filled with fear, were larger than any human's, and they shimmered like tiny galaxies. She was small, barely the size of a human child, and her clothes were nothing more than scraps of fabric clinging to her delicate frame. He could see the outline of her ribs beneath her skin, the telltale signs of hunger and neglect painfully clear. He crouched down slowly, keeping his distance, not wanting to scare her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What are you doing out here all alone?" She didn't answer, of course. She just stared at him, her body tensing as if she might bolt at any moment. Her small hands clutched at a piece of stale bread, her grip so tight that her knuckles had turned a faint glowing blue. It was clear that she was starving, and that scrap of food was all she had left. He felt a pang of guilt settle in his chest. It wasn't his problem, he reminded himself. There were too many like her, too many stories of suffering that he couldn't possibly fix. Yet as he looked into her eyes, something inside him shifted. It wasn't pity, exactly, it was more like recognition, a memory of a time when he, too, had been small and scared, wondering if anyone would ever care enough to help. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of ozone and decay. She flinched, curling in on herself, and he realized she wasn't just scared of him. She was scared of everything around her. This world wasn't kind to the vulnerable, and whatever had brought her here had clearly left her with nothing. He sighed, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small packet of rations, the kind he kept for emergencies, and placed it on the ground a few feet in front of her. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm not going to hurt you. You can take it if you want." She hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the food. Slowly, she inched forward, her movements cautious and deliberate. When she finally grabbed the packet, she tore into it with a desperation that made his heart ache. He watched as she devoured the contents, her small hands trembling with each bite. "What happened to you?" he murmured, more to himself than to her. He knew she couldn't answer, but the question lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Had she been abandoned? Lost? Or worse, had she been cast out by those who should have protected her? The longer he watched her, the more he realized he couldn't just walk away. He didn't know why, but the thought of leaving her there, alone and defenseless, felt wrong in a way he couldn't ignore. Still, the practical part of his mind screamed at him to reconsider. Taking her in would mean responsibility, complications, and possibly even danger. There were laws about harboring undocumented aliens, and breaking them could land him in serious trouble. But then she looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching, and all his doubts melted away. In that moment, She wasn't some strange creature from another world. She was just a child, a scared, hungry, and lonely child who needed someone to care. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "You can come with me, just for tonight. We'll figure the rest out later." She didn't respond, but she didn't run either. That was enough for him. Slowly, he stood and extended his hand, unsure if she would take it. For a moment, she hesitated, her gaze flickering between his hand and his face. Then, cautiously, she reached out and placed her small, glowing fingers in his. Her touch was cool, almost otherworldly, but there was a warmth in the gesture that surprised him. He gave her a small, reassuring smile and started walking, leading her away from the cold, empty streets and toward the modest home he called his own. As they walked, he couldn't help but wonder what he'd just gotten himself into. The night air was quiet, save for the distant hum of machinery and the occasional crackle of a passing hovercraft. He glanced down at her every so often, noting the way she clung to his side, her steps hesitant but determined. She didn't speak, but her presence was loud in its own way, a reminder that he was no longer alone. When they finally reached his home, he opened the door and stepped aside, giving her space to enter. She hesitated again, her eyes scanning the small, cluttered room as if trying to determine whether it was safe. Finally, she stepped inside, her small frame barely making a sound on the worn floorboards. "It's not much," he said, closing the door behind them. "But it's warm and it's safe. You can stay here as long as you need." She didn't respond, but she gave him a small, tentative nod, and that was enough. For now, at least, she was safe. But as he watched her settle into the corner of the room, still clutching the empty ration packet like a lifeline, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever her story was, it wasn't over yet. And somehow, he knew that his was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The night passed quietly, but the weight of her presence lingered in the small room. He didn't sleep much, his thoughts circling endlessly around the mystery of the little alien girl who now occupied his space. She had curled up in the corner, her knees drawn tightly to her chest, watching him with cautious but curious eyes. Despite her apparent exhaustion, she didn't fall asleep until the early hours of the morning, her breathing finally slowing into a steady rhythm. As dawn broke, he found himself standing by the window, staring out at the desolate landscape beyond. The colony had never been a place of comfort or abundance, but it was his home, a patchwork of survival and perseverance. He had come here years ago, fleeing a past he didn't care to revisit, and had settled into a routine that kept him out of trouble and under the radar. Now, with her arrival, everything felt different, uncertain. When he turned back to look at her, she was still asleep, her small frame barely visible under the worn blanket he had draped over her. In the soft morning light, the faint glow of her skin was more pronounced, highlighting the strange but delicate beauty of her features. She seemed so fragile, yet there was an undeniable strength in the way she carried herself, even in sleep. He knew he needed answers, but he also knew better than to push too hard, too soon. Whatever had brought her here, whatever had left her starving and alone. For now, she needed food, warmth, and safety, and he could provide that much, at least. By the time she stirred awake, he had already prepared a modest breakfast. The scent of food seemed to catch her attention, and she sat up slowly, her large eyes blinking against the light. She hesitated when he placed a plate in front of her, as if unsure whether it was truly meant for her. He gave her a reassuring nod, and after a moment's pause, she began to eat. "You're safe here," he said softly, watching as she devoured the food with the same urgency she'd shown the night before. I won't let anyone hurt you, but I need to know, where did you come from? Are there others like you?" She didn't answer, her gaze fixed firmly on the plate. He wasn't sure if she didn't understand him or if she simply didn't trust him enough to respond. Either way, he didn't push. Instead, he tried a different approach. "My name's—" He paused, realizing she might not even have a concept of names. He tapped his chest. "Me. That's me." Then he gestured toward her, raising an eyebrow in question. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she pointed to herself, tilting her head as if considering something. A soft, melodic sound escaped her lips, a series of tones that seemed to resonate in the air around her. He couldn't replicate it, but he nodded, understanding that it was her way of identifying herself. "It's nice to meet you," he said, offering a small smile. "I don't know what brought you here, but I'll help you. I promise." The promise felt heavier than he expected, weighted with implications he couldn't fully grasp. He had no idea what kind of danger might come with helping her, but the look in her eyes, a mix of gratitude and cautious hope, was enough to solidify his resolve. Over the next few days, a tentative routine began to form. She stayed close to him, never straying far from the small house, and he made sure she had enough to eat and a place to rest. Slowly, she began to relax, the tension in her posture easing as she adjusted to the unfamiliar environment. She didn't speak much, at least, not in words he could understand, but her actions spoke volumes. She seemed curious about everything, her large eyes constantly scanning her surroundings, taking in every detail. One afternoon, as he was repairing an old piece of machinery in the workshop attached to his home, she approached him, her gaze fixed on the tools scattered across the table. She reached out, hesitating for a moment before picking up a small wrench. He watched as she turned it over in her hands, her expression thoughtful. "You like that?" he asked, amused by her fascination. "It's just a tool, but it gets the job done." To his surprise, she began to mimic his movements, watching intently as he worked, and then attempting to replicate his actions. Her small hands were surprisingly dexterous, and she seemed to grasp the mechanics quickly, adjusting the tools with a precision that startled him. "You're a fast learner," he said, impressed. "Maybe you're not as helpless as you look." Her response was a faint smile, her first since arriving, and it caught him off guard. It was a small, fleeting gesture, but it was enough to spark a warmth in his chest. For the first time, he began to wonder if her presence wasn't just a burden, but something more, a chance for both of them to find something they'd been missing. As the days turned into weeks, he began to notice other things about her, small details that hinted at her origin. The glow of her skin seemed to intensify at night, casting a soft, otherworldly light in the darkness. She had a strange affinity for technology, often tinkering with broken gadgets and finding ways to make them work again. And then there were the dreams. He often heard her murmuring in her sleep, her voice filled with a haunting melody that seemed to echo with memories of another world. Despite the progress they had made, questions lingered in his mind. Who was she, really? Where had she come from? And, perhaps most importantly, was someone or something looking for her? The colony wasn't exactly a hub of interstellar activity, but it wasn't isolated either. If word got out about her, it could attract attention both from those who might want to help and those who wouldn't. One evening, as they sat together in the fading light, he decided to try again. "I need to know," he said gently, his tone careful but firm. "Are you in danger? Is there someone out there looking for you?" She didn't answer immediately, but her expression shifted, a shadow passing over her face. Slowly, she reached into the small bag she kept close to her at all times and pulled out a device he didn't recognize. It was sleek and metallic, its surface covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly with light. She held it out to him, her gaze filled with a mixture of trust and uncertainty. "What is this?" he asked, taking the device and turning it over in his hands. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, its design both intricate and alien. As he studied it, a sense of unease settled over him. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a simple trinket. It was important, maybe even dangerous. She reached out, her small hand closing over his as she pointed to the device and then to herself. Her expression was serious, almost pleading, and he understood that it was more than just an object. It was a key, a piece of the puzzle that was her story. "All right," he said, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. "We'll figure this out. Together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was only just beginning. Whatever secrets she carried, they were about to change everything. The days grew colder as the quiet routine between them deepened, but the unease surrounding the mysterious device lingered in the air. He had tried to study it late at night, when she was asleep, its glowing symbols casting faint patterns on the walls of his small home. Whatever it was, it felt alive in a way that no piece of technology should. When he held it, he swore he could feel a subtle hum, a pulse, as if it were reacting to his presence. He tried every tool in his workshop to figure out how it worked, but nothing made sense. It wasn't human-made, he was certain of that now. She had become more comfortable with him, even playful at times, but whenever he brought up the device, her demeanor shifted. Her eyes, usually wide with curiosity, would grow serious, almost guarded, and she would shake her head softly as if to warn him not to press too hard. It frustrated him, not because he wanted answers for himself, but because he needed to know if she was safe, if they were safe. The colony wasn't a place where secrets stayed buried for long, and he'd already caught a few neighbors casting curious glances at the strange girl he'd taken in. It was late one evening when things began to spiral. The air outside was heavy with an impending storm, the distant rumble of thunder, a reminder of how unpredictable the planet's weather could be. She was sitting by the window, her fingers tracing patterns in the condensation that had formed on the glass. He was across the room, tinkering absent-mindedly with a broken sensor, when the first knock came. It wasn't the gentle, neighborly kind of knock. It was sharp, insistent, and deliberate. He froze, his tools clattering to the floor as he turned to look at her. Her eyes were wide, filled with a fear he hadn't seen since the night he found her. She backed away from the window, her small frame disappearing into the shadows of the room. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low and steady, though his heart was racing. He approached the door cautiously, his mind racing through the possibilities. It could be a neighbor, someone curious or concerned. Or it could be worse, much worse. When he opened the door, two figures stood on the threshold. They weren't from the colony. That much was clear from their pristine uniforms and the polished insignias on their chests. Their faces were blank, their expressions cold, but their eyes held a sharpness that made his stomach twist. "Good evening," one of them said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We're with the Colonial Administration. We're conducting a routine inspection of the area. May we come in?" Routine inspections weren't unheard of, but they were rare, and they never came unannounced. He forced a casual smile, leaning against the doorframe to block their view inside. "Didn't hear anything about an inspection. What's this about?" The man's gaze didn't waver. Just checking in on residents, ensuring compliance with interspecies regulations. You understand, I'm sure. The words hung in the air like a threat. He could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the way their eyes flicked over him as if searching for any sign of deception. His mind raced. If they saw her, there would be no explaining it away. He had no paperwork, no legal justification for her presence. Harboring an undocumented alien was a serious offense, one that could land him in prison or worse. Nothing out of the ordinary here, he said, keeping his tone light. Just me and a quiet night. Appreciate you checking in, though. The other man, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. We've had reports of unusual activity in this sector. It's important that we verify there's nothing unusual taking place. His chest tightened. Reports? From who? The neighbors. He'd been careful, keeping her hidden from prying eyes as much as possible. But all it took was one stray glimpse, one whispered conversation, for everything to unravel. Unusual, he repeated, feigning confusion. Not sure what you mean. Like I said, it's just me here. The man's gaze narrowed, and for a moment he thought they might push past him. But after a tense silence, they stepped back. We'll be in the area for a few days, the first man said. If you see or hear anything unusual, report it immediately, for your own safety. With that, they turned and walked away, their figures disappearing into the shadows of the street. He closed the door slowly, leaning against it as he exhaled shakily. His hands were trembling, but he didn't have time to dwell on the fear. He turned back to find her standing in the center of the room, clutching the device tightly to her chest. They're looking for you, aren't they? He said quietly. She didn't respond, but the guilt in her eyes was answer enough. Whatever this was, whatever she was hiding, it wasn't just a matter of survival. It was bigger than him, bigger than the colony. And now, he was caught in the middle of it. The next few days were a blur of tension and paranoia. The officials were true to their word, their presence a constant shadow over the colony. He spotted them speaking to neighbors, scanning the streets with handheld devices that emitted faint, unsettling beeps. He kept her inside, away from the windows, but the walls of his small home felt like they were closing in, the weight of their shared secret growing heavier with each passing hour. One night, as the storm finally broke, he found her sitting in the corner, the device glowing faintly in her lap. She looked up at him, her expression conflicted, and he realized she was trying to tell him something she hadn't been able to say before. "What is it?" he asked gently, sitting down beside her. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she held the device out to him. He took it carefully, the hum beneath his fingers more pronounced than ever. As he looked at her, she reached out, placing her small hand over his heart. It wasn't just a gesture, it was something more, something that sent a rush of images and emotions flooding through him. He saw flashes of a world unlike anything he'd ever known, a place of light and energy, vibrant and alive. He felt her fear, her loss, and the weight of her mission, whatever it was. And then he saw them, the ones who had taken everything from her, the ones who were still searching, still hunting. When the connection broke, he was left gasping, his mind reeling from the intensity of what he'd just experienced. She looked at him, her eyes filled with an unspoken plea, and he knew there was no turning back. Whatever she was running from, it was coming closer. And whatever her mission was, it wasn't finished. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the faint sound of distant footsteps. The storm had arrived in full force, and with it, the sense that their time was running out. The storm raged on outside, a chaotic symphony of wind and rain that drowned out every other sound. But inside the small home, the silence was deafening. He sat there, the glowing device still pulsing faintly in his hands, her unspoken plea hanging heavy in the air. His mind raced, trying to process what he had seen, what he now understood about her, and the danger they both faced. It was no longer just about hiding her or keeping her safe. This was bigger, far bigger than anything he had imagined. She stood abruptly, her small figure illuminated by the faint glow of the device. Her movements were quick, almost frantic, as she began pulling objects from her bag, a series of small metallic components that looked like parts of some intricate machine. He watched in confusion as she arranged them on the table, her hands moving with purpose, her focus intense. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. She didn't answer, but her expression was one of determination, her earlier fear replaced by a resolve that unsettled him. It was clear she was preparing for something. Then came the second knock. It was louder this time, more forceful, and his stomach dropped. He glanced at her, and she froze, her wide eyes meeting his. The storm outside masked much of the sound, but the urgency of the knock was unmistakable. This wasn't another routine visit. Whoever was at the door wasn't here to ask questions, they were here for her. He moved quickly, motioning for her to hide. She hesitated for only a moment before darting into the small storage room, closing the door silently behind her. His heart pounded as he approached the door, his mind scrambling for a plan. When he opened it, the two officials from before were standing there, but this time they weren't alone. Behind them was a third figure, cloaked in a dark, high-collared uniform that shimmered faintly in the rain. Their face was obscured by a hood, but there was an undeniable air of authority about them. The two officials stepped aside, and the hooded figure stepped forward, their voice low but commanding. "We know she's here," they said simply, their tone leaving no room for argument. "Hand her over, and no harm will come to you." He hesitated, his grip tightening on the edge of the door. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "There's no one here but me." The figure tilted their heads slightly, as if studying him. "You're lying," they said, their voice colder now. "We have ways of knowing." Before he could respond, the figure raised a small device, and a sharp, piercing sound filled the air. He winced, covering his ears, and behind him, he heard a faint hum, an echo of the device she had given him. The hooded figure turned their heads slightly, the movement deliberate. "She activated it," they said, more to themselves than to him. "Clever girl. But it won't save her." His chest tightened as the implications of their words sank in. The device wasn't just a tool, it was a beacon. She had known they would come, and she had called for something or someone in response. But what or who would answer that call? Before he could process further, the storm outside seemed to shift. The wind picked up, carrying with it a low, resonant hum that was different from the natural sounds of the storm. The officials exchanged uneasy glances, and even the hooded figure seemed momentarily taken aback. The hum grew louder, and the ground beneath them trembled. He turned, his eyes scanning the horizon through the open door, and his breath caught. A faint light was cutting through the storm, growing brighter with each passing second. It wasn't lightning, it was something else, something deliberate. The hooded figure cursed under their breath, their composure cracking for the first time. They turned to the officials. "Prepare for extraction," they barked. "We're out of time." Inside the house, the storage room door creaked open, and she stepped out, clutching the device tightly. Her expression was a mix of fear and determination as she moved to his side. He wanted to tell her to go back, to stay hidden, but he knew it was pointless. Whatever was coming, she was at the center of it, and there was no stopping it now. The light outside intensified, and a deafening sound like a thunderclap echoed across the colony. The officials drew weapons, their faces pale, while the hooded figures stood rigid, their gaze fixed on the source of the light. A massive shadow began to emerge from the storm, its form sleek and angular, unlike any ship he had ever seen. It hovered above the ground, its presence commanding and otherworldly. "They found her," the hooded figure muttered, their voice laced with a mix of frustration and awe. He glanced at her, his heart pounding. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She looked at him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and resolve. For the first time, she spoke words he could understand, her voice soft but clear. "My family." Before he could respond, a beam of light shot down from the ship, illuminating the area. The hooded figure turned to him one last time, their voice sharp. "You don't understand what you've done. This isn't just about her. It's about all of us." The words sent a chill through him, but there was no time to dwell on them. The light from the ship intensified, and everything around him dissolved into chaos. The hooded figure and the officials began to retreat, their earlier confidence shattered. As the ship descended closer, he felt her small hand slip into his. Despite everything, her touch was steady, as if she had made peace with whatever was about to happen. But for him, the questions only multiplied. Who was she, truly? What had she brought to his quiet life? And what would come next? The ship's light engulfed them, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The wind, the rain, the hooded figure, retreating into the storm, it all faded into a blinding, pulsating brilliance. He held her hand tightly, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. Her calmness unnerved him, but it also grounded him. Whatever was happening, she seemed to know what to expect, even if he didn't. The ship hovered low enough now that its massive underside was visible, an intricate maze of glowing lines and shifting panels. A section of it opened, revealing a descending platform bathed in the same ethereal light. Standing on the platform were figures unlike any he had ever seen. They were tall and slender, their forms cloaked in a shimmering material that seemed to ripple like liquid metal. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their presence radiated an overwhelming sense of purpose. She stepped forward, pulling him with her. He hesitated, glancing back at the house, the colony, the life he had built. But her grip on his hand was firm, and the determination in her eyes left no room for argument. They walked together toward the beam of light, the storm swirling around them in a chaotic dance. The hooded figure shouted something from a distance, but the words were lost in the roar of the ship's engines. As they reached the edge of the beam, one of the tall figures raised a hand, palm outstretched. The air between them shimmered, and he felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't threatening, if anything. It was reassuring, like a silent promise that he was safe. The figure spoke, their voice resonating in a way that bypassed his ears and echoed directly in his mind. "You protected her," the voice said, calm yet commanding. "You kept her safe when others would not. For that, you have our gratitude." He wanted to respond, to ask the countless questions racing through his mind, but before he could, another figure stepped forward. This one was smaller, their frame delicate yet commanding in its presence. They approached the girl slowly, kneeling to meet her gaze. A silent exchange passed between them, a connection so profound it was almost tangible. Then, the smaller figure turned to him, their glowing eyes softening. She is more than you know, they said, their voice filled with both sorrow and pride. She carries the legacy of a lost people, and with it, the hope of many worlds. He frowned, struggling to comprehend. I don't understand, he admitted, his voice trembling. Why did she come here? Why did she choose me? The smaller figure smiled faintly. She chose you because you are human. Because even in your smallest acts, you show kindness and courage. She needed a protector, and she found one. The words hit him like a wave, leaving him speechless. Before he could respond, a sudden shift in the air drew his attention. The hooded figure had returned, flanked by the officials, and this time they weren't retreating. They raised weapons, their faces set with grim determination. Don't let them take her, the hooded figure shouted, their voice cutting through the storm. You don't know what she'll bring. The tall figures moved swiftly, raising their hands in unison. A barrier of light erupted between them and the attackers, deflecting the first volley of energy blasts. The air crackled with tension as the two sides faced off, the storm mirroring the chaos below. Amidst the standoff, the girl turned to him, her small hand reaching for the device he still held. He hesitated, but her gaze was steady, filled with an understanding far beyond her years. Reluctantly, he handed it to her, watching as she pressed it to her chest. The device began to glow brighter, its hum resonating with the storm, the ship, and even the ground beneath their feet. What is she doing? He asked, his voice barely audible over the rising noise. The smaller figure turned to him, their expressions somber. She is activating the beacon. It will bring an end to this conflict, but it will also call them. Call who? He demanded, panic creeping into his voice. But before he could get an answer, the device emitted a pulse of energy that rippled outward, silencing everything for a brief moment. Then the sky changed. The storm clouds parted, revealing not just stars, but massive shapes moving against the backdrop of space. Ships, dozens of them, descended, their forms sleek and otherworldly. The hooded figure and their men froze, their weapons falling limp at their sides. The arrival of the fleet had shifted the balance of power entirely. The tall figures stepped forward, their voices resonating as one. The time has come. The lost are found, and the reckoning begins. The girl turned to him one last time, her expression bittersweet. He realized then that she wasn't staying. This was goodbye. You're leaving, aren't you? He asked, his throat tightening. She nodded, her small hand reaching out to touch his arm. Though she didn't speak, he felt her gratitude, her affection, and her sorrow in a single, overwhelming wave. She had brought him into her world, but now she had to return to it. As she stepped onto the platform with the others, he felt an ache he couldn't explain. The ships above began to move, their presence filling the sky with a sense of inevitability. The hooded figure and their men were taken into custody without a fight, their resistance crushed by the overwhelming force of the fleet. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light faded. The ships vanished into the night, leaving the colony quiet and still. He stood there, the storm finally subsiding, the weight of everything settling on his shoulders. He returned to his home, the silence inside almost unbearable. On the table, where the device had once rested, he found something new, a small, glowing crystal. When he picked it up, he felt her presence, a faint echo of her voice, and a promise that she would never forget him. The next day, life in the colony resumed, but everything felt different. The world had changed, even if no one else realized it. He carried the crystal with him, a reminder of the girl who had come into his life and the extraordinary journey they had shared. And though he didn't know what lay ahead, he knew he would never be the same. The following days were eerily quiet in the colony. The storm had passed, leaving a stillness that felt unnatural after the chaos of recent events. People went about their routines, but whispers lingered about the strange lights in the sky and the sudden disappearance of the officials who had once patrolled the area with such authority. He kept his head down, trying to process everything that had happened while grappling with the ache of her absence. He carried the crystal with him everywhere, tucked safely in his pocket. When he held it, he felt a faint warmth, as though a small piece of her remained with him. Sometimes, he thought he could hear her voice in the back of his mind, a soft hum of reassurance that he hadn't been forgotten. It was a comfort, though it didn't make the emptiness any easier to bear. Work in the fields became a distraction, the rhythmic tasks keeping his hands busy while his mind wandered. He replayed every moment of their time together, wondering if he could have done something differently, if there had been a way to keep her safe without sending her away. But deep down, he knew the truth. She had never truly belonged here. Her place was out there, among the stars, with her people. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he felt a strange pull to the edge of the colony. It was the same place where the ship had descended, the ground still marked by faint scorch lines. He stood there, staring at the sky, searching for any sign of her. The crystal in his pocket seemed to hum faintly, a vibration that spread through his hand and up his arm. He closed his eyes, focusing on the sensation, and for a brief moment he felt connected to something far beyond himself. The next day, a letter arrived. It wasn't uncommon for the colony to receive communication from the central hubs, but this one was addressed specifically to him. He opened it cautiously, his heart racing as he scanned the contents. The message was cryptic but clear. Someone had taken notice of his involvement with her. They wanted answers, and they weren't willing to wait. The letter set off a new wave of unease. He thought he had left the danger behind when the ships disappeared, but it seemed her presence had drawn more attention than he realized. He burned the letter in the fireplace that night, watching the edges curl and blacken as the words disappeared. Whatever questions they had, he had no intention of answering. Not yet. Weeks turned into months, and life began to settle into a semblance of normalcy. He rebuilt the parts of his home that had been damaged during the storm, and even started to make plans for expanding the small garden out back. But the crystal remained a constant reminder of the girl and the world she had opened to him. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, he found himself talking to it, as though she could somehow hear him. It felt silly, but it also felt right. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the stars, the crystal began to glow. It was faint at first, just a soft flicker, but it grew steadily brighter. He held it in his hands, his heart pounding as he felt a wave of emotion wash over him, hope, excitement, and something else he couldn't quite place. The light from the crystal expanded, enveloping him in a warm glow, and for a moment he felt as though he were floating. When the light faded, he found himself standing in a vast, open field beneath a sky unlike anything he had ever seen. The stars were closer here, their colors vivid and shifting like a living tapestry. A gentle breeze carried the scent of unfamiliar flowers, and the air was filled with a soft hum that seemed to resonate with his very being. She was there, standing a few paces away. Her small frame was silhouetted against the glowing horizon, and her eyes shone with a light that was both familiar and otherworldly. She smiled when she saw him, a mix of joy and relief in her expression. "You came," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that melted the distance between them. "I didn't know I could," he replied, his voice trembling. "How is this even possible?" She stepped closer, the glow from the crystal in his hand matching the light in her eyes. "The crystal is a bridge," she explained. "It connects us even across the vastness of space. I wanted to show you everything." Over the next hours, or what felt like hours, she led him through a world unlike anything he had imagined. She explained more about her people, their history, and the legacy she carried. She showed him the ruins of her homeworld, the towering structures that once stood as monuments to her people's ingenuity and the devastation that had reduced them to dust. He listened in awe and sorrow, his heart aching for all that had been lost. But she also showed him hope. The ships he had seen that night weren't just a rescue mission, they were a promise. Her people were rebuilding, creating a new home where they could live in peace and prosperity. And she had played a key role in making it happen. As she spoke, he began to understand why she had come to him in the first place. It wasn't just about survival. It was about finding someone who could see her, not as an alien or a threat, but as a person. Someone who could remind her of the kindness and compassion that still existed in the universe. Their time together passed too quickly. When the light from the crystal began to fade, signaling the end of their connection, he felt a pang of sadness. But she reassured him with a smile, placing her small hand over his. "This isn't goodbye," she said. "It's just the beginning." When he returned to his home, everything felt different. The air seemed lighter, the stars brighter, and the world more alive. He carried her words with him, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always hope. In the years that followed, he became known in the colony as someone with an unshakable sense of purpose. He shared his kindness freely, helping others and building connections that strengthened the community. And though he never spoke of her or the crystal, he kept their memory close, a quiet light guiding him through the rest of his days.